name is Robert Myers, and I am the director of the Center for American Studies and Research here at the American University of Beirut. Thank you all for coming to tonight's lecture. I have the distinct honor of introducing Dr. Lizabeth Cohen from Harvard University. She's the Howard Mumford Jones Professor of American Studies and Chair of the Department of History at Harvard University. She also teaches in the graduate program in History of American Civilization at Harvard, from which our distinguished Edward Said Chair this year also hails, Noel Ignatieff. She received a BA from Princeton, a Ph.D. from the University of California, Berkeley. She taught at Carnegie Mellon, NYU, before coming to Harvard in 1997. In her historical research and writing on 20th-century America, she aspires to bring together social, political, and cultural history. Her first book, which is entitled Making a New Deal, Industrial Workers in Chicago, 1919 to 1939, which was published by Cambridge, won the Bancroft Prize in American History, the Philip Taft Labor History Award, and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. She's also the co-author with David Kennedy of an American History College textbook entitled The American Pageant. Most recently, she has published A Consumer's Republic, The Politics of Mass Consumption in Postwar America, which was published by Knopf in 2003 and Vintage in 2004. She is currently at work on a book entitled Saving America's Cities, Ed, Logue, and the Struggle to Renew Urban America in the Suburban Age, which I assume will have something to do with tonight's lecture. It's under contract with Farrar, Straus, and she is the recipient of several fellowships, such as the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Guggenheim Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Studies, and the Taubman Center for State and Local Government, the Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston, and the Real Estate Academic Initiative, all of Harvard University. It is with distinct pleasure that I introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Lizabeth Cohen, who will talk about saving America's cities in the post-war suburban age.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Robert. Can you hear okay? Well, I'm delighted to be back in Beirut. I was here in December of 2003 as part of the group of people who came to advise about setting up CASAR. And it's wonderful to be back 6 years later and see it up and running. When I was here before, my book, A Consumer's Republic, had just come out, and I talked about that. And then we had a very lively discussion afterwards that I still remember about consumerism and advertising and marketing in the Middle East, not just in the United States. And so today, as I share my recent work with you, which is a book on urban redevelopment in the United States after World War II, I'm hoping that after you hear what I have to say about a very American story, that you will have ideas to share about redevelopment in Beirut today, as well as in other cities that you may know very well. I think there are some very interesting connections that we may make. Walking around Beirut today, I have to say, I don't think I've ever seen so much construction going on in one place at one time. It looks very different from the United States, where, as many of you may know, as a result of what we call the Great Recession, which is what we're going through right now, construction is very dead. Projects are sort of stopped halfway. Other projects that were slated to begin have not begun. So Beirut looks very different. There's a lot of urban redevelopment obviously going on, and I hope that we can talk about some of the connections that you might see, similarities and differences. So thank you for coming, and let's begin. The disastrous failures in rebuilding New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina have raised fundamental questions in the United States and indeed throughout the world. And most recently, I think we've seen this in the wake of earthquakes in Haiti and Chile, about cities, about who, if anyone, should plan them, about the proper balance of public and private interests that should be served, and public and private resources that should be expended in city building, and who and what a city is really for. In many respects, the crisis over reconstructing New Orleans, where private developers and uncoordinated volunteers rather than professional planners and government programs have run the show. This culminates 3 decades of neoliberal urban policy in the United States. And this just shows you protests in New Orleans about the lack of any government role in the rebuilding of New Orleans. For nothing, thanks. FEMA refers to the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and the SBA is the Small Business Administration. And so this is basically just a photograph of protests that this was basically a private, whatever happened was basically a private sector undertaking, and the government was fairly absent. In recent times, it has been widely assumed that the public interest in cities is best served by empowering private markets and their agents, and retreating from the top-down, government-funded and orchestrated urban planning that had characterized the more social democratic era that preceded this one, from the 1930s into the 1970s. In particular, the huge federal investment in what was known as urban renewal. Today, in the face of the economic crisis that began in 2008, which has challenged Americans' confidence in market self-regulation in the realm of finance, it is appropriate to examine closely another arena of American life that over the post-war period underwent a dramatic transformation from public sector management to private sector domination, in this case led by real estate developers and their allies. It's time to probe how America's cities have fared and how well the common good has been served over the decades since World War II, during which cities struggled to hold their own as devastating deindustrialization, rampant suburbanization, and exploding globalization challenged cities' longtime prominence as the control center for corporate capitalism and the breeding ground for American social mobility. I'm currently writing a book that addresses the big dilemmas facing America's cities today by placing them in the history of city rebuilding from the early 1950s to the present. Even as neoliberals are losing some of their ideological hegemony and political influence in Washington, profound questions still remain about how the United States should keep its cities viable in the 21st century. President Barack Obama's new Office of Urban Affairs, while putting urban revitalization on the nation's agenda, explicitly states on its website that, quote, President Obama knows that Washington doesn't have all the answers. He knows that communities across America are finding innovative, cross-cutting solutions, end quote. In a recent visit to Harvard's Graduate School of Design, Obama's Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Sean Donovan, peppered his lecture with references to the necessity of public-private partnerships. I have identified 5 interconnected problems that American cities as built environments face today that this recent history can help us understand. First, cities, much like the nation as a whole, labor in the early 21st century under the expectation, traceable back to the assumption of the immediate post-war period, that continual economic growth manifest through constant physical development signifies a city's health. At the same time, Americans today, and increasingly since the 1960s, have also valued the small scale and persistent presence of the historical city. And growing awareness of environmental sustainability also defies a growth at any cost approach to cities. This tension, then, between building for the future, sustaining the present, and preserving the past continues to challenge cities and their residents today. Second, since the 1960s, particularly after the publication of Jane Jacobs' influential Death and Life of Great American Cities, its very simple cover, which has become a classic, pictured here, in 1961, objections to the big government projects of urban renewal grew among critics on both the right and the left. For both ends of the political spectrum, ironically, Jane Jacobs became the patron saint. Perhaps unjustifiably, conservative, private sector-oriented city builders have embraced Jane Jacobs' defense of the so-called organic city block that developed without government intrusion, quote, free of the superimpositions and the great allocations of the planners, end quote, according to conservative ideologue William F. Buckley. The left has long praised Jacobs for her call for more democratic participation in planning and appreciation of neighborhood diversity. In fact, the combined skepticism of the right and the left against big planning, specifically federal urban renewal, contributed to the rise of a more private sector-driven urban redevelopment since the 1980s in countless cities. Let's not allow the government to overreach and repeat the mistakes of urban renewal, goes the mantra. Although the dismissal of large-scale urban renewal as a damaging overreach has prevailed for years, very recently, the failures in New Orleans and the deterioration of urban infrastructure elsewhere in the United States have prompted new calls for government oversight and new appreciation for large-scale planning. Suddenly, understanding better what actually happened during the massive undertaking of urban renewal has taken on new significance. Related to this re-examination of the appropriate role for government in city building is a third problem. What is the right balance between public and private sector activity in urban development? Even with the huge expenditures of federal dollars for urban renewal during the 1950s and the 1960s, city administrators still depended on private investment. It is imperative today to understand the full range of options historically available for public-private collaboration in order to distinguish simple private sector participation from strategies that put private interests in the driver's seat. An equally important dimension of sorting out the respective responsibilities of the public and private sectors is the role ordinary citizens should play in urban planning decisions. Left critics of urban renewal projects, inspired by Jane Jacobs and others, may have shared conservatives' rejection of what they called the federal bulldozer, that was the conservative term, but not their preference for private sector autonomy. In fact, people on the left have advocated for more, not less, public input into planning decisions through community involvement. The long history of post-war urban rebuilding can help us calibrate the best balance between public and private activity in improving cities. Fourth, the United States has struggled throughout the post-war era with how central its cities would and should be to the nation's economic future. What you're seeing here is just a classic American suburban landscape with major highways intersecting, shopping center at the middle, suburban housing tracts surrounding. In the 1950s and 1960s, massive suburban development of residences, retail, industry, and offices threatened the viability of urban downtowns. In many ways, urban renewal was a government-supported strategy for reviving cities becoming increasingly abandoned for metropolitan growth outside of city borders. And even after the urban renewal era ended in the 1970s, cities continued to plot to increase their share of metropolitan wealth with uneven success. Recently, however, as climate change and rising energy costs challenge the viability of limitless sprawl, attention is returning to the virtues of density, access to mass transit, and other urban amenities. But even as these pressures seem to portend an urban revival, another reality simultaneously threatens to undermine it. Much of the economic revitalization of urban centers during and after the urban renewal era has revolved around rebuilding downtowns to attract the infrastructure of a FIRE economy. And that stands for finance, insurance, and real estate. And what you see here is downtown Boston, with the assumption that dynamism downtown would trickle down to all residents. The financial crisis of 2008 and its aftermath have threatened just those FIRE sectors of the post-industrial economy, particularly the banks, investment houses, and commercial real estate companies, whose investments made possible the new Boston, revitalized Charlotte, North Carolina, or kept Manhattan humming. A long view of the place of cities in the evolution of the post-industrial economy is thus called for. So too is an assessment of how much FIRE at its height actually had widespread benefits. Finally, modern architects and modernist planning have written the rule book for city builders since the 1950s. As cities competed with the booming suburbs for workers, shoppers, and residents, they constructed Le Corbusier-style highways and ring roads to bring suburbanites downtown. They competed with suburban shopping centers by erecting equally sleek urban malls with attached parking, replaced city grids with superblocks and new kinds of off-the-grid urban spaces to inject a new monumentality into the city and attract large-scale private investment, replaced working-class walk-up apartments with luxury apartment towers to keep the upper middle class living in the city, physically separated urban functions in a way that risked deadening downtowns outside of prime working and shopping hours, and hired prominent architects to build everything from subsidized housing to iconic new public buildings. By the 21st century, large-scale modernist urban redevelopment became less common than several decades earlier, but even with today's more piecemeal, private sector-driven approach to urban revitalization, trophy buildings by celebrity architects have only grown in significance, often at the expense of more systematic consideration of larger neighborhoods and districts. My book aims to address these pressing questions facing all who live, work, plan, or care about cities today by mining the history of post-war urban redevelopment. I am doing this by following the career trajectory of a central figure in this effort, a man named Edward J. Logue, who was engaged for over half a century in rebuilding American cities. I do not plan a traditional biography, but rather an investigation where Logue serves as my main character and vehicle to tracking a half-century of urban strategizing in bricks and mortar. Ed Logue may not be a common household name now, but he was very well known in his own time and remains so in many circles today. Crowned, quote, one of the top 3 urban renewal men in the US by Time magazine in 1964, dubbed the Master Rebuilder by the Washington Post in 1967, and Mr. Urban Renewal by the New York Times in 1970, and described, quote, as one of the most impressive movers and shakers of subsidized construction since the time of King Tut, that's my favorite, by Newsweek in 1972, his signature is written on many American cities that underwent urban renewal in the second half of the 20th century, because he worked there, because he advised them, or because his urban solutions set a national model. Anyone who visits Yale University and observes firsthand the struggles of New Haven, Connecticut, or travels to a thriving downtown Boston, or catches sight of the tram crossing New York City's East River to Roosevelt Island, or notes the amazing recovery of the South Bronx in New York City, has encountered, whether knowingly or not, the legacy of Ed Logue. He was, as the New York Times architectural critic Herbert Moucham put it at his death in 2000, quote, among the last of the master planners to practice urban renewal on an epic scale, end quote. More recently, renowned architectural critic Ada Louise Huxtable lauded Logue in a blistering condemnation of the stalled reconstruction of the World Trade Center, entitled, New York's 9/11 site needed not a Moses, but a Logue. She argued, and I quote her, Logue was the kind of smart, tough, dedicated professional who would have provided the leadership that Ground Zero needed desperately and never had. Unlike the autocratic Moses, he was a remarkable human being who cared about people as much as he revered the quality of the environment. A practical visionary, he knew how to implement a plan without rolling over to every political constituency and special interest. And he got things done. After decades of turning dreams into reality, he knew a lot about what made cities good places to live and to work. Ed Logue not only was an influential figure in city building during the second half of the 20th century in his own right, but he also represented a generation of urban renewal professionals who thrived during a moment in American history when enormous public power and money was invested in remaking cities. Because he moved around a lot in his career, taking lessons learned in one job to his work in the next, Logue in the end reshaped many American cities and offers a way of tracking urban change over half a century. Moreover, his evolution as an urban rebuilder reveals a more changing and complex picture of post-war cities than the simplistic morality tale that has come to dominate of a titanic struggle between the forces of good, embodied for many by urban renewal critic Jane Jacobs, and evil, represented by developers like Robert Moses and Ed Logue, who are all lumped together in that kind of scenario. I am organizing my book around 4 major episodes in Logue's city-building career: rebuilding New Haven, Connecticut in the 1950s, Boston, Massachusetts in the 1960s, New York City and State from the late 1960s through the mid-1970s, and the South Bronx from the late 1970s to the mid-1980s. Each episode captures an important stage in the evolution of strategies for saving American cities from the early 1950s through the 1980s. Ed Logue's first of 4 major projects in urban redevelopment was New Haven, Connecticut, where he arrived in 1954 at age 33 to work closely with newly elected reform mayor Richard Lee. He brought a range of experiences to the job of heading the New Haven Redevelopment Agency that would shape how urban renewal unfolded in New Haven and, by example, elsewhere in the nation, as this city became a laboratory for federally funded urban renewal. As a former Yale undergraduate and law student, he had pushed the university, the city's major business, in progressive directions on civil rights, in recognizing organized labor on its own campus. And this is Logue as a young man, and what he's wearing there you probably can't see, but it's a Union button. And in protecting academic freedom in the Cold War 40s. Urban redevelopment became, in his mind, one more progressive undertaking, not the pro-business, anti-democratic effort that later critics frequently charged. As a bombardier in the American military during World War II, he had observed the virtues of large-scale planning and maneuvers. And just before his arrival in New Haven in 1954, he had served as special assistant to Ambassador Chester Bowles in India. Well-positioned to observe the State Department and Ford Foundation-funded infrastructural improvements and social programs that aim to modernize villages and make India a democratic, anti-communist ally of the United States. And that's Chester Bowles in the middle there, and obviously Nehru. For a die-hard liberal like Logue, modernizing the built environment became an inseparable part of perfecting democracy and fulfilling promises of greater equality. Under Logue and Lee's watch, New Haven, which was a relatively small city with a long declining industrial base, became the nation's model city of urban renewal in the 1950s, receiving more federal dollars per capita than any other American city. By 1965, 2.5 times greater than the next highest, Newark, New Jersey, a surprise to many familiar with the city's problems in recent years. Logue's work in New Haven raised all the hard questions and epitomized all the flawed solutions that would hound much urban renewal for the next 2 decades. Implemented during the heyday of the Eisenhower-era stress on commercial redevelopment rather than the more housing-oriented slum clearance of the previous Democratic administrations of Presidents Roosevelt and Truman, revitalizing the city's economic centrality to the region became a major priority. What you see here is, that's Logue there on the right and Mayor Lee in the middle, and they have a model of their new downtown plan. With a paucity in New Haven of deep private pockets to dig into, the federal government's investment became crucial. Logue's genius was figuring out how to minimize actual expenditures locally by finding in-kind matches and maximizing federal investment. His New Haven redevelopment agency became so well-heeled with federal funding, so powerful, and so independent that it was known locally as the Kremlin. The plan involved putting a major highway, the Oak Street connector, and you see that right down there, and then you see that whole downtown area that was in the plan has been leveled in this picture. So putting the major highway, the Oak Street connector, through a physically deteriorating but still socially intact low-income neighborhood to facilitate bringing retreating suburbanites back downtown. Constructing high-rise luxury apartments to keep the middle class living in New Haven, replacing much of New Haven's 93-acre downtown core, which had had small stores and modest service establishments, with a mix of suburban-style department stores, an enclosed mall, a hotel, an office tower, and a massive attached garage, parking garage, which you see there, to compete better with the new suburban shopping centers, and replacing rundown housing with new modernist complexes. And then on occasion, they also rehabbed existing structures that often, intentionally or not, encourage gentrification. In most of the residential projects, land was cleared and new townhouses or low-rise apartment buildings were constructed, requiring significant relocation of current residents, in some cases temporarily, in other cases permanently. The major exception to this clearance and then rebuilding was the Italian neighborhood of Worcester Square, one of the very first examples in the nation of housing rehabilitation rather than demolition and new construction, permissible under a change in federal law in 1954. Logue always took great pride in his agency's pioneering work in the Worcester Square neighborhood, even though critics charged that rehab favored better-off homeowners over renters and removed poor black residents from an adjacent area. Although Logue optimistically believed that, quote, we're on our way to a slum-free city, end quote, when he left New Haven in 1961, it is clear today that urban renewal did not save New Haven, although it is unlikely that the city would have fared much better without it, given its deep economic problems and the state of Connecticut's favoring of suburbs over cities through its tax structure and other policies. Few would claim that urban renewal in New Haven was a success. Downtown continues to struggle. Much of the replacement housing has not worn well, and the city remains a poor, minority-dominated core surrounded by affluent white suburbs. As true believers in the power of federal urban renewal, Logue and Lee thought that federal urban renewal dollars could buy a future for New Haven. They learned two important lessons. First, that displacing residents with massive clearance only breeds resentment and despair. Racial tensions, some of them rooted in the disruptions of urban renewal, flared dangerously in the riots of August 1967 in New Haven and continued to fester long thereafter. And second, like it or not, within a capitalist economy, private investment, ranging from the private homeowner to the deeper-pocketed industrialist, must complement public spending for urban revitalization to work. New Haven's urban renewal failed on many levels, including in calibrating an effective mix of public and private resources. It is not clear, however, where outside of Yale University, which has at this point, not so much in that period, has invested deeply in New Haven, where would this private investment have come from, if not from Yale? Logue was recruited to Boston, his second urban renewal site, by newly elected Mayor John Collins in 1960 to help him turn around a near bankrupt Boston that in the previous decade had lost 13% of its population and 8% of its jobs to booming suburbs and had only built 2 new office buildings in the previous 30 years. And here you see Logue standing. And this is Mayor Collins, who had actually had polio in the 1950s, so he was in a wheelchair. And they're in front of an enormous hole which became Government Center, which I will show you shortly. Boston's tax base was declining precipitously, and its tax rate was the highest in the nation. Recognition of the failure of New Haven's urban renewal lay in the future, and Ed Logue was considered a leading young star of what seemed like a landmark effort to revive America's cities. Collins gave Logue unprecedented centralized authority over the city's planning and redevelopment as head of the Boston Redevelopment Authority, known as the BRA. By 1968, the BRA would be staffed by 700 employees, where there had been only 16 when Logue arrived. And Collins gave his blessing to a renewal plan that involved half of the city's acreage. Needless to say, Logue's arrival made a very big splash in the conservative old seaport city of Boston. Over a little more than 6 years, Logue became widely credited with launching the New Boston, which has been viewed as an urban success story, at least until the recent economic downturn. In Boston, Logue sought to improve upon his New Haven strategies and Boston's own sorry episode a few years earlier of the wholesale demolition of the city's West End immigrant neighborhood, which resembled on a much larger scale the destruction of New Haven's Oak Street area, which I told you about earlier. Having learned from the excessive leveling and unapologetically top-down approach to urban renewal in New Haven, Logue experimented in Boston with strategies that would achieve more buy-in from capitalist interests on the one side and neighborhood residents on the other. In Boston, Logue worried less about bringing middle-class people back into the city to live and focused instead on creating jobs downtown, specifically in a 60-acre government center complex of federal, state, and municipal headquarters built on the site of Scully Square, Boston's former red light district. And this is what went into that enormous hole you saw in the previous picture. There's City Hall in the middle, federal office building, and state office buildings. He then used that leverage to pressure Boston's business leaders to erect new office towers nearby. With the promise of more workers downtown, he next goaded merchants to help renovate the city's retail core. And then this is, I wanted to show you just the State Street Bank building that was part of that effort to get the private sector to invest. And he got merchants to invest in the city's retail core to do renovations, and he launched plans to rehab and reuse Faneuil Hall and Quincy Market, the decaying old wholesale markets whose eventual renovation provided the prototype for the urban festival marketplace phenomenon nationwide. And after Faneuil Hall was the first one, there's Quincy Market, and then there, South Street Seaport in New York, Baltimore got one. They're just all over the United States. Okay. In Boston, Logue also became more committed to achieving high design standards in his projects, which inevitably led to modernist structures on superblocks such as the new Boston City Hall. Simultaneously, in the face of growing popular criticism of urban renewal nationwide, he became more vigilant about implementing what he called a planning with people policy, consulting neighborhood residents about project planning with differing degrees of conviction and success. What you see here is Logue in the second row, surrounded by a variety of people in Roxbury, which is the African-American neighborhood of Boston. Major neighborhood projects took place in Roxbury, the center of Boston's growing black population, Charlestown, a bastion of working-class Irish, and the South End, a mixed ethnic, poor neighborhood close to downtown. Some of this community consultation was pure window dressing, but in some places, such as in the Washington Park district of Roxbury, and that actually this community group is from there, residents were actively engaged in contemplating their community's future. Moreover, rehabilitation supplanted demolition as the BRA's first line of attack. As Boston's urban renewal took off, the federal dollars poured in, moving Boston from 17th to 4th in per capita renewal grants nationally. In a matter of years, a new Boston emerged for which Logue received credit, though his failure to win election as the city's mayor in 1967 provided disappointing evidence to him that not everyone in the city viewed his tenure favorably. Whereas there is no question that Boston's potential as the economic heart of New England, of the New England region, made Logue's job easier there than it had been in New Haven, still, urban renewal in Boston succeeded in combining federal dollars and private investment to support a more dynamic Boston economy and built environment. And although there were legitimate criticisms, such as that Logue's BRA planned with some people and not others, homeowners over renters, for example, and favored large-scale commercial redevelopment over sustaining small merchants and protecting neighborhoods, in Boston, government officials like Logue kept control over the planning process while still encouraging private investment and cushioning, to a noteworthy degree, the dislocating effects of urban revival, in many cases working closely with nonprofit community organizations. Boston's balance sheet still registered discontented and dislocated residents as it negotiated the fragile tension between growing an economy and protecting existing communities, but the city did turn around economically while retaining much of its historic fabric and diversity of population. Having resigned his post at the BRA to run for mayor, Logue found himself jobless in the fall of 1967 and saddled with a substantial campaign debt. By winter, he had perched as the visiting Maxwell Professor of Government at Boston University while he contemplated his next career move, entertaining overtures from Los Angeles, San Francisco, Cleveland, and Baltimore, among other opportunities. Soon, he would get a job offer that propelled him into the third phase of his urban redevelopment career and allowed him to address two frustrations he was increasingly encountering in his urban renewal work. One, the difficulty creating mixed-income urban communities, and two, relatedly, the limitations of single city-based redevelopment for making more socially and economically integrated metropolitan areas. America's urban problems, he argued, could only be solved by developing projects that cross social class and city boundaries. So when New York's liberal Republican governor, Nelson Rockefeller, called in the winter of 1968, first to seek Logue's advice on drafting legislation to create a new kind of powerful statewide urban renewal agency, and soon after to offer him the job as its president, Logue jumped at the opportunity. Rockefeller, you see him here, for his part, was also frustrated with the usual way of doing business as he watched his bond issues to build badly needed subsidized housing and other industrial, commercial, and civic infrastructure keep getting defeated at the polls. For the first time in the nation, the semi-autonomous redevelopment agency, which had been a common structure for overseeing urban renewal in cities, would be tried on the state level. Rockefeller and Logue designed what they called the New York State Urban Development Corporation, known as the UDC, a public benefit corporation funded with an initial appropriation of $17 million and the authority to self-finance through issuing its own bonds up to $1 billion, later increased to $2 billion, to be backed by what was called the moral obligation of the state. And the moral obligation bond was actually an effort to circumvent the voter approval process for increasing state and municipal bond limits by indicating a state's intent, though not obligation, to meet bond payments. Most controversially, at Logue's insistence, the UDC had the power to employ eminent domain, which means to seize land in the public interest, to override local zoning laws and building codes, and to make its projects tax exempt. New York State legislators adamantly resisted the creation of providing exciting opportunities for architects to innovate, putting up 33,000 units of housing, much of it subsidized for low and moderate income residents and the elderly, constructing 3 new towns, 2 in upstate New York and 1 Roosevelt Island in the East River of Manhattan, right actually between Manhattan and Queens, and creating 10 industrial parks and more than a dozen downtown renewal projects. I will focus here on the 2 projects that addressed most directly Logue's larger political agenda for the UDC of social reengineering and metropolitan planning. You see here a picture of Logue in the middle with two people from the UDC, and this is a site in Brooklyn where they were putting up the Marcus Garvey Village, which was a very experimental public subsidized housing that was low-rise rather than tall towers, but very high density. The first case, Logue's pride and joy, was the car-free, mixed-income, new town in town, is what it was called, of Roosevelt Island, planned for the nearly abandoned welfare island by Philip Johnson and John Berge to house 18,000 residents in 5,000 apartments. Though, with the demise of Logue's UDC in 1975, the full development was stunted. Logue wanted the welfare island location for this ideal of his, ideal sort of community, so badly that he agreed to Mayor John Lindsay's demand that he develop several other difficult New York sites in addition. Quote, "I got the goat sites and I got the island," is how he bluntly recalled the deal. What I have dubbed Logue's Great Society Utopia on the East River provided him with the opportunity to create from scratch the kind of socially integrated community that he had long idealized by mixing subsidized housing for low-income and elderly tenants with market-rate retail and co-op apartments, by scattering small-scale public schools and daycare facilities throughout the buildings, and by providing for large families and physically disabled residents 15 years before the latter was mandated by the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. New construction, like Roosevelt Island and the two new towns upstate, appealed to Logue. You see him here as Roosevelt Island is being built, as ways of avoiding the complex politics stemming from clearance and dislocation in already inhabited sites. They also offered unique opportunities to create socially integrated communities, so difficult to achieve within an existing socioeconomically segmented urban fabric. And the icon of Roosevelt Island, if you've been to New York, is this tram that ran between the east side of Manhattan and the island. And that when it was the only access, actually, for years, because it was the subway that does now run was extremely delayed. The second UDC project that expressed Logue's social priorities was an effort in 1972 to introduce a metropolitan solution to the state's housing crisis by establishing a bold, fair share housing program. The plan involved putting 100 units of affordable housing in 9 wealthy suburban Westchester County towns, threatening, if necessary, to use the UDC's power to override local zoning. The response of these communities to the proposal to locate subsidized housing in their midst was quick, thunderous, and unyielding. Not only were the UDC's proposals rejected outright, and Logue himself subjected to death threats, but the state legislature curtailed the UDC's override powers in New York's villages and towns as punishment. Over the next 2 years, the convergence of a number of factors threatened the UDC's survival as an aggressive statewide agency that coordinated public and private investment around progressive social priorities. Growing antagonism in Albany toward the UDC's independent power, President Richard Nixon's impounding of congressionally approved housing subsidies upon which the UDC depended as he redirected Washington policy away from President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society to his own new federalism, and a severe financial crisis in New York City and state that made New York bankers less willing to lend to the UDC. Even without a financial crisis, however, the bankers were increasingly uncomfortable with the UDC's way of operating. They charged that Logue was spending beyond the UDC's means by not making its projects self-supporting. Logue retorted that he had a social mission and was not running a for-profit business. In early 1975, Logue was forced to resign by New York's new governor, Hugh Carey, who also called for an investigation into possible corruption at the UDC. Ed Logue and Nelson Rockefeller's great experiment was ending in public inquisition and disgrace, marking not only the fall of Logue's UDC empire, but also the end of an era of large-scale public investment in the urban built environment. The Commission's final report exonerated the UDC of any corruption, but concluded that the state's oversight of UDC's finances had been too lax, and Logue's UDC so single-minded in pursuit of a social agenda that it had taken unwise financial risks. Logue reflected later, quote, "It was too good to last, and that's why I so cordially despise bankers. They felt threatened. I was engaged in," bankers actually said this, "social engineering, as if that's a mortal sin. I was very proud of the fact that Roosevelt Island was a total piece of social engineering." The defeat of the UDC marked the end of an era of government control over the physical development of the nation's cities, and it sent shockwaves through redevelopment circles nationwide. From here forward, rebuilding cities to make them more receptive to the post-industrial economy and to cushion their citizens from the deepening inequities that would accompany that new economy would increasingly be left to the private sector. What housing wasn't in the hands of private enterprise was left to poorly funded but scrappy nonprofit community development corporations known as CDCs. Logue's fourth major phase of urban redevelopment work would take place in this new era of city building, and his work there is instructive for how he adjusted his liberal agenda to the new political and economic realities of the late 1970s and onward. After 3 years as a consultant trying to keep his hand in what he considered his life's work, Logue finally got back in the urban redevelopment saddle when in 1978, New York City Mayor Ed Koch appointed him executive director of the South Bronx Development Organization, which was referred to as the SBDO. This was a job that Logue desperately wanted. As he put it, quote, "I'm not going to let that son of a bitch, Hugh Carey, write the last chapter of my public life." That's kind of the way he talked, unquote. In truth, there were not too many competitors dying to tackle the near impossible job of rebuilding the ravished blocks of the South Bronx, decimated by arson, impoverishment, and population loss. Here, Logue faced the worst urban devastation of anywhere he had ever worked, and with fewer financial resources than he had ever had at his disposal. What you're seeing here is President Jimmy Carter walking on the site of Charlotte Street, which had been, he was on his way from the airport to the UN and stopped in the South Bronx to see this site and was very moved and horrified that this was America. And after this visit, vowed that he was going to spend huge amounts of money revitalizing places like the South Bronx, but that money actually never really arrived. But where many of his former colleagues in Boston and the UDC saw a humiliating career come down, Logue sensed a unique opportunity to make a difference and threw himself into the job. In its smaller scale and make-do strategies, the SBDO reflected a major shift in the nation's approach to its urban crisis. Logue marshaled whatever federal, state, city, and private foundation resources he could muster, and collaborated more than he ever had before with truly grassroots community organizations. Ironically, forced to operate within the limited and market-oriented emphasis of President Ronald Reagan's urban agenda, Logue came closest here to fulfilling his longtime motto of planning with people. But the scale was small, and the effort to turn around the South Bronx, for him, frustratingly incremental. An industrial park promising jobs here, a block of new houses there, the need to advocate for greater social services for impoverished residents everywhere. Ed Logue is best remembered in the South Bronx for his unorthodox plan to repopulate the abandoned, rubble-strewn Charlotte Street neighborhood with owner-occupied, single-family, prefabricated ranch-style houses with picket fences. Logue had been impressed that amid the decay of the Bronx, some homeowners persisted in caring lovingly for their homes, and many new immigrants from the Caribbean and other developing countries wanted to own their own land. Making use of the federal mortgage subsidies that now were becoming available in the new era of market solutions to urban problems, Logue's Charlotte Gardens, as it was called, offered houses at $52,000, $30,000 less than they actually cost, with only 10% down. The project's opening won front-page attention in the New York Times and many other publications. An enthusiastic reception from the lower middle-class New Yorkers it was aimed at, and wholesale rejection from the national community of planners and architects whose approval Logue had carefully cultivated throughout his career. They dismissed this suburban housing tract within an urban setting as a harebrained scheme, too low in density and lowbrow in aesthetics. Logue acknowledged that, quote, "This stuff will not win the architectural awards that I have enjoyed receiving," but he felt this prefabricated housing was the best hope for reviving the South Bronx. His long-term plans included establishing a factory to manufacture houses to create new jobs as well as more new dwellings. A year and a half ago, on the 30th anniversary of President Jimmy Carter's famous visit to devastated Charlotte Street in 1997, which led to what became the SBDO, current Charlotte Street homeowners proudly showed off their homes to reporters. And these were pictures I took just driving around the neighborhood. These journalists were impressed with the well-kept houses, the health of the neighborhood, and the South Bronx's recovery more generally, which the SBDO is often credited with having helped make possible. In the South Bronx, Ed Logue, limited financially and isolated professionally, had used whatever subsidies he could tap into to push privatization and other market approaches to urban redevelopment in more democratic social directions. The product of a collaboration between the SBDO and the local nonprofit UDC, the Mid-Bronx Desperados Community Housing Corporation, as it was called, Charlotte Gardens, small in scale, bootstrapped in implementation, modest in impact, became a prototype for whatever city building was not in the hands of a profit-seeking private sector as the 20th century ended and the 21st century began. A further departure from the ambition and some would say hubris of New Haven's massive urban renewal of some 30 years earlier is hardly imaginable. So what can we learn from city builder Ed Logue's experiences in urban redevelopment over more than 3 decades? And particularly his effort to balance public and private power to keep American cities viable, even flourishing. Whereas his first foray into urban renewal in New Haven suffered from a lack of both private investment and engagement with the communities affected by redevelopment, in Boston he achieved more buy-in from the private sector and neighborhood residents, albeit with more complaints from the latter. But he also recognized the intractability of inequality produced within cities undergoing urban renewal. And he aimed through the UDC in New York to tackle this problem by designing new socially mixed urban communities like Roosevelt Island, and by redressing urban woes with metropolitan solutions like the Fair Share Affordable Housing Program. After the era of federally funded urban renewal ended, and Logue struggled to improve the South Bronx with the limited tools provided by the Reagan administration, he saw his job as using what limited power he had to steer private resources in a direction that benefited Bronx residents. I hope it's clear from Logue's career that first, it is an enormous distortion to paint the federal engagement in urban renewal with one condemning brush. As the neoliberal reconstructors of New Orleans, and it must be said, the Jane Jacobs-worshipping anti-planners, including many of my colleague historians, tend to do. Rather, urban renewal varied tremendously over time and over setting, and had more positive attributes than its critics might acknowledge, and more detriments than its defenders at the time would have admitted. Second, it should be evident that whatever the scale or ambition of the urban redevelopment project, whether rebuilding the downtown of New Haven or Boston or a few streets of the South Bronx, there was no escaping the necessity of balancing public resources and private investment. This dilemma left liberal planners like Logue, who considered themselves experts, deserving of the power and resources to fix problems, frustrated and vulnerable to criticism and constraints from three sides. First, from private capitalists like the New York bankers who balked at investing without the most profitable of returns. Second, from ordinary city residents, understandably fearful of threats to their communities. And third, from critics of urban renewal, often propelled by Jane Jacobs' influential critique, to reject planning in favor of her call to preserve the organic, as she called it, evolution of city streets, at their best blessed with mixed uses, short blocks, varied building types, and population density. Not surprisingly, Jane Jacobs, who you see here, and Ed Logue did not like each other. They had several angry exchanges, including a celebrated face-off at a forum on city planning at the Museum of Modern Art in March 1962, soon after the publication of her Death in Life. Jacobs considered Logue the epitome of the bulldozing urban renewal. Quote, a very destructive man. He thought it should all be wiped out and built new. Boy, in my books, he went down as a maniac, end quote. While Logue argued that Jacobs's resistance to interfering with the so-called natural evolution of blocks and neighborhoods perpetuated the status quo, thereby, intentionally or not, abandoning the cities and relieving uncaring and increasingly suburbanizing elites of all responsibility for urban recovery. He accused Jacobs of speaking as a resident of the safe, relatively well-off neighborhood of Greenwich Village, a privilege which slum dwellers did not enjoy. Quote, not surprisingly, he went on cynically, this approach has won her many new friends, particularly among comfortable suburbanites. They like to be told that neither their tax dollars nor their own time need be spent on the cities they leave behind them at the close of each workday, end quote. Saving America's cities from the deep troubles created by today's Great Recession, and I'm speaking of today in the United States, perhaps not here in Beirut, will not be easy. The New York Times has already begun to warn of the consequences in articles like, All Boarded Up, How Cleveland is Dealing with Mass Foreclosures, and the effort to save Flint, Michigan by shrinking it. It is clear that in this urban crisis, as in earlier ones, private investment will be essential for recovery. The question will be, as it has been throughout the post-war era of city building, what role government authority should play in the process. All Ed Logue's projects combined public and private investment, but when he succeeded best, the public side called most of the shots. Quote, I've always felt you can't trust the private sector to protect the public interest, he told an interviewer late in his career. What public funding gave Logue was the leverage to push private investment in a more socially responsible direction, in contrast to recent years when what got built was what private developers thought would turn a profit. That has meant that while Manhattan, San Francisco, Boston, and Dallas have thrived, Detroit, Hartford, Cleveland, and Newark have not. And what John Kenneth Galbraith called social goods in his classic book, The Affluent Society, written in 1958, the public infrastructure of roads, bridges, schools, and trains that yield no profit have fast deteriorated. The lesson of Logue's long career as a city builder, then, is not that we must abandon the private side of the equation. Unfortunately, history tells us that is not realistic. Recognizing this public-private interdependence is not the same thing, however, as calling for public-private partnerships. This lingo has crept into the discourse surrounding improving the urban built environment, but it represents something quite distinct. It comes out of the privatization drive of the 1980s that aimed at enhancing the private sector's role by encouraging it to assume more of the responsibilities traditionally performed by government. The National Council for Public-Private Partnerships was founded in 1985 to advocate actively for these arrangements. Most recently, the Bush administration's Department of Transportation began encouraging private investors to lease roads and bridges from states and run them at a profit. At the same time, we must not lose and should enhance the commitment to public participation in the city rebuilding process that grew out of the challenge to top-down urban renewal and has managed to survive in some cities, even with a more private sector-driven redevelopment process. Ed Logue was not quite 79 when he died in the year 2000, but it was fitting that he passed just when the 20th century did, as he was very much a man of that disappearing era when big government in the United States took responsibility for solving social problems like inadequate housing, and in the best cases, sought to use its leverage to direct private investment toward the public interest. In a prime example, Logue's utopia of Roosevelt Island, in a prime example on Roosevelt Island, a strong community identity continued to flourish into the 21st century. And in the census of 2000, a remarkably diverse socioeconomic population persisted. And this is particularly the case in New York, where it's a very segmented world of upper middle class neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, and so forth. This is what the 2000 census revealed, that the island's population was 45% white, 41% black and Latino, and 11% Asian, representing an unusual annual income spread from 37% making under $35,000 to 23% earning over $100,000, with 40% in between. With the recent building explosion of market-rate luxury condominiums on Roosevelt Island, however, it is not at all clear what the census of 2010 will reveal. When the largest residential disaster in U.S. history devastated the city of New Orleans in 2005, 5 years after Ed Logue's death, the likes of Logue were nowhere to be seen. 2005 was a very different time from 1955, from 1965, 1975, and even 1985. But understanding the state of city building, both its successes and its failures, at all these moments can give us historical perspective, wisdom, and courage to address the pressing urban issues of our own time. We can only imagine a future for the urban-built environment in the United States and perhaps in the world if we thoroughly understand its past. Thank you. Now, you wanted me to take this off now? Is that, no? Keep it on. Okay.
We have a microphone if we have any questions.
And I would, as I said earlier, I would very much be interested to hear about any parallels you see or don't see between the urban environments you know well and the story that I told you of the United States.
Thank you so much. While people contemplate that question, and there are many, we actually talked about it in American Studies today in relation to your lecture. Having spent many years in New York, and this was something that also came up in the American Studies class today, is that Robert Moses, as I recall, did not drive. Nonetheless, he wanted to ram a highway through Manhattan, and this is one of the reasons that Jacobs is so revered, is that in fact she was instrumental in stopping what is retrospectively seen to be a very bad idea. And so it's true that New York is an anomalous American city, but one of the ways in which it is anomalous is that it has varied transportation, which is a huge and growing problem here in Beirut. The fact that the automobile and this fetish of the automobile has determined development. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if that was something that we had talked about. Would you talk about the rise of the automobile in relation to these questions of urban planning, maybe?
That's a great question, Robert, and was very much, of tremendous concern at the time. And that was basically what was fueling suburbanization in the United States, was the automobile, were making possible movement of people out of cities to suburban communities, which were being supported by lots of other federal policies, like mortgages that were supported by veterans mortgage loan programs and so forth. But people like Logue, and here I would be critical of his perspective, and you saw it very much in New Haven, I mean, felt that the only way to save American cities from this phenomenon of Americans moving out to live and then being followed by retail stores and shopping centers and eventually by jobs, whether factories or even industrial parks with white-collar jobs. The only way to fight that was actually, they thought, to build roads that would make it possible for people to still get back downtown. They were also putting in apartment houses, as you saw in the New Haven picture, to try to keep people downtown with attractive new kinds of residences. What they didn't quite calculate, though, is that those roads went two directions, and they didn't necessarily continue to attract people downtown. And as jobs started to move out, many cities were very much left abandoned. And as I was suggesting, it was kind of the exceptional cities that managed to be revived. The automobile is critical, and someone like Logue, these would be where I would be, I would feel that he did more damage than good when it came to roads, because he was very tied to that as a strategy. And he did not put the central artery into Boston, but he came very much out of that generation. In the last several years, it's really taken many years, we have finally taken down that central artery and put in a tunnel that goes underneath the city called the Big Dig. So that, what I'm trying to do here, maybe this is a good opportunity to sort of emphasize that, because as I would agree that the automobile was very detrimental, and someone like Logue had a solution, as you saw in New Haven, that didn't really work, is that there were things that he did that were good and things that he did that were very damaging, and that what I'm trying to do is bring a little bit more nuance and gray into a story that has been told as very black and white. Jane Jacobs good, Robert Moses bad. When actually, there were a lot of ways in which the things that people tried in the 50s were very much need to be understood in the context of those times. That people who were tied to cities were in a complete panic as Americans were moving out. They thought, what's going to happen to cities? Department store management was feeling like there was going to be no future for downtown department stores. They were behind efforts to put in roadways like the Embarcadero in San Francisco, or Moses's, Lower Manhattan Expressway, which you were referring to, that Jane Jacobs up. And a lot of it was very blind, and now we know actually, quite mistaken. And so we have the Embarcadero in San Francisco has been taken down. As I told you, the Big Dig has now replaced the central artery in Boston. And many other cities have gotten rid of those roads that were aimed to bring people directly downtown. But I think we have to understand that at the time, they were struggling to figure out how to keep cities alive, how to keep people working downtown if they had moved out to suburbs, how to keep people shopping downtown rather than taking all their dollars to suburban stores. Eventually what happened is that the downtown department stores actually built branches and eventually, in many cases, closed down their downtown stores, and all there are suburban shopping malls. But I think we have to historicize the process. And I would say that the automobile was a great challenge to urban America, and particularly to a city like Boston that was so old that its streets were extremely narrow, perhaps a little bit like Beirut, and ill-equipped to handle the entry of the automobile. But it was a great dilemma.
Hi, thanks for a really interesting presentation. I was wondering whether or not Logue had a vision for the role of green spaces in urban areas. I noticed those nice, very green, grassy lawns and Charlotte Gardens. Did he have a concept of the role that public green spaces could play in revitalizing urban areas?
No, that's a good question. I think we could see Roosevelt Island perhaps as his most ideal spot, because there he had a chance to make it from nothing, you know, and Roosevelt Island had somewhat high-rise, high-density buildings surrounded by lots of public open space. And that was very much the concept of the modernist, you know, Corbusier influenced city builders, and to some extent he was coming out of that, where there would be density in living surrounded by, you know, open space. Charlotte Gardens, of course, is not that, because that's privately owned front lawns. And, you know, it was not, that was very much in contrast to most of the building he had done before that. But it was a strategy to try to bring in the American ideal to save a part of the city that he felt was, you know, so deteriorated and needed investment and people to be willing to stay and put resources into it. So I think he did. In a lot of his projects for the UDC, there were public spaces. What he was apparently, I interviewed last week a woman who had worked with him in the South Bronx on the SBDO project, and also again when he came back to Boston after the South Bronx, he was a consultant and worked on a variety of projects, and she had worked with him on an effort to move Emerson College to Lawrence, Massachusetts, which was a very kind of poor deindustrializing city, and so the idea was to try to use moving this campus to redevelop the city. And she said that what would have driven him crazy about today would have been all the environmental regulation, that he would have, you know, having to submit all of his plans to lots of regulation and review would have, you know, just made him tear his hair out. But, you know, he would have adapted. But the environmental issues involved in a lot of this, it was just another era. People were not thinking about that. Though it has to be said, to give him credit, that Roosevelt Island was car-free. This is going back to your question, Robert. So that does suggest to some extent he recognized the problems that the automobile brought with it. So that what they had, these electric, and here he was actually did also have some environmental consciousness. They were electric-run buses. And there was a big parking garage as you came over from the Queens side, where you were to leave your car if you had one, and then to walk or to take this little electric bus to where you were going. So there was a way in which there was some environmental consciousness there, even, you know, at that time. But I suspect he was really very much a kind of New Dealer with a notion of social housing motivating him. And so his greatest concern would have probably been building lots of affordable housing. That would have been the priority. Yes, Patrick.
I was intrigued by this idea or this question about whether so-called natural evolution of cities preserves the status quo versus the idea of tremendous centralized power, which to some extent Logue had, and how that has transformed many cities in different periods. I get Paris, obviously, von Haussmann, and I don't know, the Ringstrasse in Vienna, Ceausescu's Romania, Olmsted, in a way, you know, although I think at that time it's, you know, cities were growing, you could sort of go to the edge and carve out large areas and do this kind of massive, well, I mean, I think he thought of it as social engineering, you know, green space in the city as a way of helping the dangerous classes to become middle class. And then, of course, later on developing suburbs himself. But in Beirut, you know, we have this bizarre situation where we have massive control by a private corporation entirely over this very center of the city, and they're able to do, I guess, what some people might think of as aesthetically pleasing things, like von Haussmann did, I guess, successfully, just in some people's eyes, you know, controlling the heights of buildings, making sure there are sidewalks and plantings. There are, you know, residents, you know, residential mixed use with shopping and entertainment, and so I mean, you can intervene in ways that don't challenge the status quo at all. I don't know, these examples are not all the same, of course. So are you coming down on the side of saying that there's something really good about having the ability to intervene and to be able to control things?
Well, I'm trying to mess it up a little bit and raise questions about both perspectives. You know, the more private-driven redevelopment that would, privilege what the private sector does, like Solidaire and downtown Beirut. I see that very much as a phenomenon of coming out of a private market-oriented solution. Though I have questions that I would very much like to hear from you about related to that. So I want to suggest that there are limitations to that. I also want to suggest that there are certainly limitations to the urban renewal top-down big government plan, but also limitations to a Jane Jacobs type critique that says, let's not let government do that. And here's where it gets tricky. The people who are very market-oriented have embraced her and assumed that her kind of her desire not to have there be planning from the top would justify the kinds of things that have become private market-oriented. But you're suggesting, in an example like Solidaire, you've got both sort of you have a market orientation, but you also have a very top-down plan. What I sort of wonder about is how to understand what happened here. Whether we just see that as coming out of this era of city building, to what extent the fact that there had been such devastation after the Civil War can explain it, how helpful it was for them to argue that they were putting it on the footprint of the previous of the city before the war, whether that helped to justify it as being sort of a public good, and how much protest there has been. I mean, I know because I just got here yesterday and it was here for a week 6 years ago. I obviously know very little. I gather there's been some protest from this St. George Hotel about the idea that Solidaire could take the waterfront area. But I'm just wondering whether there's been a questioning, or has this just been seen as such a good thing for a society that was trying to sort of revitalize itself? Have people questioned whether what basically a private corporation is doing is really for the public good? And I would also wonder how much of what has gotten built is not private business, offices, retail. In a more organically, naturally developing city, there are some public spaces and places that are not part of privately owned. So I'd love to hear from anyone who feels they have some grasp. Maybe you, Patrick, know more about that. You could answer some of these questions.
I can sketch an answer. Now, for the protest, there was some kind of protest at the time, but it wasn't effective at all. You have to remember that we were coming out of very, very hard times. The model proposed, the successful model proposed, was the Hariri model. He was at the same time in the government. He was behind the Solidaire project. And therefore, this model was the one that was more or less imposed. It's a monologue, which is a special case in Lebanon. So I think that had they really managed to propose an infrastructure that would have allowed private people, mostly people who really owned the land, people who were tenants in the place, instead of giving them shares, had they given them the opportunity. And the Lebanese are known for their enterprise spirit, right? I think we would have had a totally different center that would have been more alive in many ways, in many respects. But maybe that's too late. I mean, to lament on for now. What is rather troublesome for me is that for example, more dwellings were supposed to go in the center, and every now and then they change their rules and they allow for more offices because those sell better, except for the towers on the seafront. So we see less activities happening in there having to do with domestic living, normal living in a city. One could argue that all the centers are condemned anywhere. That this is the, but I think that there could be a reversal of trend, but this would depend a lot on the politics and what happens in the next few years. I mean, the optimistic ones would tell you that a change in the political landscape in the country might reverse the trend, but you don't know if the other trend is better, so that's another issue.
That's very helpful, and I would say that, just comment that, one of the mistakes of modernist planning in general, but particularly in this urban renewal period in the United States, was to isolate functions and in fact make downtowns purely work and retail oriented and not have dwellings. And now cities like, there's just so many American cities that are struggling, whether it's Cincinnati or Cleveland or even Detroit. What they recognize they need to do to bring them back is put residences downtown. Because once people, even Flint, Michigan, apparently, which was a major automobile production city, which has had terrible devastation. I was reading an article recently about how they're even putting in lofts downtown Flint as a way to get artists and people who are looking for somewhat of an urban experience and are wanting to live downtown to do so, because it does then keep people around, more than 9 to 5, which is pretty devastating for a lot of cities. So that should be a lesson that even you would think a market-oriented solution, according to people who think the market works, would have learned something from American mistakes, and maybe it will change. I mean, I have noticed that as we were walking around today, that some of the areas that are clearly outside of the corporation that are still going through a lot of redevelopment. I mean, it's just incredible to see all these. I can't figure out who's going to live in all these apartment towers, and but there's clearly a lot of residential building going on close to downtown. Whether people will actually go to downtown, I don't know.
Concerning those high-rise, high-end, extremely high-end apartments, I think the danger we are incurring is that it depends who's going to buy them. There is an ongoing market now for people from the Gulf. And the problem with this is that you build a city of ghosts, because they do not live here. They would come for a month per year, and you have all these. I mean, if you take it to the most simple side of it, that is, you have this bulk of this mass of construction that is not really contributing either to the economy nor to the life of the city, and they will remain empty for most of the year. This is the real problem. I think. Question of scale. The city is changing in scale. And it is not built for the people who actually live there. And my discourse has nothing nationalist about it.
No,
it's just a pragmatic discourse about who is going to live in those buildings.
That I was suspecting that was that it was a lot of outside investors. And in fact, we had this. You probably could explain this better, but we went looking for the Sarsuk Museum, and so we finally found it, and a guard came out and said, "Oh well, the museum is closed, and I don't know if it will ever reopen." And next to it was Sarsuk Village, which was a kind of big urban development, very high end, which clearly the land was extremely valuable, and it looked like the family had sold off the land or developing the land for condos or whatever, and I don't know what the fate of the museum is, and it didn't seem like the guard did either. Oh, okay, let's get the story on that.
There is a misunderstanding here.
Okay,
the
please.
The land next to the Sarsuk Museum is the Sarsuk Gardens or Towers.
Yeah.
It's just named after the street.
Ah, okay.
But the land belonged to the Bistros family. I mean, they are relatives
Okay.
to the Surso, but it's another story. And the Surso Museum is closed because of renovation. They are digging underground, and it's going to reopen.
I hope so. He said he didn't know if it would, but maybe he just didn't know when it would.
Maybe the guard there is not the proper person.
Yeah.
To ask
Oh, well, that's good. I was glad to hear it because, you know, when it was so, it seemed to be such a stark confrontation of here was a museum. It's true, it was a private museum, but still a museum, a public place that seemed to be, you know, closed, and a rather poignant statement.
I was trying to bridge these two fascinating stories, Beirut on the one hand since the Civil War, and then post-war America and its cities. And I have a kind of a fantasy question for you. If Jane Jacobs and Logue were walking around with you today, what would they say? And would they agree on anything?
Well, I think they would probably both dislike the solidaire solution, that of a private corporation sort of owning downtown. That would not have fit, and they would have been coming from very different directions. I mean, Jane Jacobs would have been lamenting the loss of the authenticity of whatever might have been there before. Now, would she have done with the fact that it had been destroyed in a civil war? I don't know. That would have been a challenge to her, because I think we have to remember, though, that and the important thing here is I have a lot of admiration and respect for Jane Jacobs and her message. I think the point I'm trying to make is she was a critic, an important critic, but it isn't necessarily a solution in city building terms. And so she might have, I don't know what she would have said, but she would have been critical of it from that point of view, that this was, you know, there was no authenticity there, was not mixed uses, it was not, you know, there was, she talked about the ballet of the sidewalk, you know, where there was all this performance on the street. You know, what you see instead are lots of guards and very clear prescribed uses of the cafe tables outside, and, you know, there would be no there for her. From Logue's point of view, I think he would have felt that this was the private sector enriching itself at sort of the public expense, and why not, he might have wanted to put subsidized housing downtown. Along with, he never wanted to isolate, he did not actually believe in public housing. He did not want to isolate it. I think that's another way that Roosevelt Island was very much his utopia, because it had market rate, high-end condominiums, as well as subsidized affordable housing, and housing for the elderly and people with disabilities. So he would have wanted to probably bring residents there and have it be mixed income. Have there be mixes of incomes. I think, do you want it for the tape, or are you okay?
Yeah, it's okay. Liberal and I think here the situation is the ever-liberal. I mean, when you say neoliberal, it means that things happened before it that made liberal economy, the liberal position come after. Here, since independence, you know, we are into the laissez-faire policy. Mm-hmm. So there is no way one could think of social housing anywhere, for that matter, not even in the center. We're not into that model at all. It's always been private enterprise, private market, and that's how it goes.
There's been no pressures for that.
Not at all, and this has to do with the whole structure of society. And, questions of politics and left and right are always tempered by confessional affiliations, regional affiliations, and therefore it's very hard to have movements that really can operate any change. On the other hand, this is balanced by community services. So you have, you know, even religious and confessional groups proposing to help the new generation, if you want, of that particular community to find dwellings, and maybe they give them some money for it so that they don't leave the country. But all of this has to do with the struggle on who survives better on this land, rather than as a national project. for housing the poor. It has to do with local, the local clientele, if you want, of the groups.
That's very interesting. I mean, some people would argue that in the United States, the period from the New Deal in the 1930s to the middle 1970s is really the exception. And there's the same kind of sort of embrace of a private sector laissez-faire strategy, and that there was this sort of short moment when people wanted a more powerful federal government to do anything. And now, you know, they've retreated from that. It remains to be seen. I mean, we're sort of still sorting that out. If you follow American politics at all, it looked for a while with the election of Obama that maybe that was not fair to say, and that people really did want the federal government to be back in doing things. Now there's been so much opposition to efforts to get the federal government involved in things like health care and education and so forth that, you know, it's not clear at all where the American people come out. So, you know, we're probably somewhere between what you describe and, say, the French, who would be more comfortable with a strong state. It's interesting that the French model did not seem to rub off on Lebanon, despite the French presence of the state taking on some of those responsibilities.
Yeah, I mean, the planning of the French was never implemented. They did bring in planners, and nothing was implemented. It was local politics and local interests of people in power made it that nothing was ever implemented. Maybe that was good.
Yeah, right, that's possible.
Comment. Is this thing on?
You have to push it.
Oh, okay.
Good.
I had a comment, I think, although I think you would want to respond to it. I mean, I start with the premise that in this society, every public institution is the precise opposite of what it pretends to be.
This society meaning the U.S. or here?
US.
Okay.
Well, capitalist society in general. That is, the prisons spread crime, the hospitals spread disease, the schools spread ignorance, and so forth. And it seems to me that perhaps a way of reformulating the discussion between, say, Jane Jacobs and Logue is not that one was right and the other is wrong, but that market-driven construction is bad and public-driven construction is worse. And I'm a little bit reminded of a comment a fellow worker made to me one time when I was trying to explain to him the virtues of socialism. And he said, well, that sounds pretty good, but I don't see how we're ever going to have that under capitalism. And I was particularly moved to that by you know, saying, for instance, that you regarded the Big Dig in Boston as something of a correction to the Central Artery. Did I misunderstand you?
As a built environment.
As a built environment, yes, but as a longtime resident of Dorchester and a person who regards himself as a victim of the Big Dig. I mean, I wonder if you would comment sort of on that and respond to my general dismal take. The science of public development.
It's interesting to me that you would say that you, both being failures, you would take the private sector over a kind of public sort of action. I'm not sure I would make that choice. I think that's where we might differ. I would say there are, and I'm trying to show here the problems and the difficulties in both, and the need for sort of checks, whichever should run, you know, free without any checks on it at all, whether there be a public process or whether it's private driven, whether there be community involvement when it's you know, going to be government driven. But I don't know, I just feel, and I would have thought you would have, I'm a little surprised knowing your politics that you would feel more comfortable with a profit-driven strategy. That, I guess I guess I'm enough of a liberal to feel that consideration of the public good, at least in the intent to try to do something that's considered a social good, would be preferable in my book to something that's just purely about profit for shareholders or the owners of the project. So that's how what I would say about that. And so, I mean, it's a struggle. There are, obviously things don't work as many people like Logue thought they would. We've seen that, and yet, I don't know, I think it's a struggle worth having to try to figure out how to try to create an urban environment that actually does serve more than those who are seeking to make profits from it.
I haven't been in Beirut that long, but from what I can tell, low-income housing is basically the equivalent of the strong rent control. And for all the other things that we can maybe pay off the police for here, rent control seems to be really disrespected by everyone throughout Lebanon and has kept perhaps lower-income people in, nicer areas throughout the country.
So there is rent control, you're saying. There is a regulation of, is in Lebanon, and is it based on the actual building itself, or does a person carry it with him or her by their income, what they make? I would be very interested to know about that.
It's not based on income, but I'm going to pass this on to someone.
But it's very good to hear that.
Can you respond to that?
I don't know what you mean exactly by rent control, but what is happening here is that if you have been in an apartment for, let's say, 20 years and you used to pay very low rent, the owner of the place cannot suddenly multiply it by 10 or whatever, right? It's a very slow increase.
I see.
And for years, people were paying rents that were almost nothing. They would pay the equivalent of $100 per year, and they did it for 20 years. So of course, the owners of these apartment buildings put a little bit of pressure on the government, and then they started to increase them based on some sort of gradual increase, and so far it has worked. I mean, people are managing to live, if not in the middle of the city, but in the close suburbs. So I think we don't have that kind of a problem now. What's more difficult is for people to really be able to buy a place now. The prices coming up and the demolition of buildings that were more or less of an average quality, and now we have all these speculations on lands, and people are demolishing buildings. This is another issue, is what we do with the heritage of late 19th century and modern heritage. It's a serious issue, and the city is transforming very, very, very fast.
It's interesting about rent control. I mean, that would suggest something that is a regulation, a government regulation. So it does suggest a little bit of intervention in the private market, in the laissez-faire. And rent control, I'm not an expert on it, but it's been very controversial within the United States. A city like New York had rent control for many years, which is being sort of phased out. Many private sector people hate rent control, and they argue that it is ultimately destructive. Cambridge, Massachusetts had rent control in some of its major cities. And the private sector people argue that it's ultimately destructive of the housing stock because private landlords won't invest in buildings if they can't get back the rent. And so there are progressive types who will actually join that position and say that rent control isn't the solution, that you should means test individuals and give them subsidies so that to make up the difference between what they can afford and what the market rate for the housing is, because that way you'll give the landlord some incentive. But what we see, of course, in cities in Massachusetts where rent control was finally taken away, is those programs, even though they exist to try to help people bridge that gap, aren't very helpful, because as soon as rent control was lifted, many of these landlords turned their properties into condominiums or sold them off to other owners. And so in fact the housing stock is no longer really there as rental housing. There's so many more incentives for people to own within the United States, and it sounds like perhaps here as well, that it's become, the situation is actually, it was one of the few silver linings to the current economic crisis in the United States, is that the rental market is back because people can't get financing and can't afford to buy. And so there actually is a lot of rental housing available right now. But in general, there was a trend towards everything going into the private real estate market. Well, if there aren't any more questions, thank you very much. I learned a lot from you.